It began quietly, as history-changing events often do. In the year 541, in a port city near the mouth of the Nile, people started dying. No one knew why. Within months, the disease had reached the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, and from there, it would ripple outward, reshaping the course of European, Middle Eastern, and North African history. This was the Plague of Justinian. In the early 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire stood as one of the most powerful and complex civilizations in the world. Often referred to by historians as the Byzantine Empire, it was, in the eyes of its rulers and people, simply the continuation of the Roman state, unchanged in spirit, even as its geography and character had evolved. At its center stood Constantinople, a vast walled capital city perched on the Bosporus, a natural crossroads between Europe and Asia. Here, East met West, and ancient Roman institutions mingled with Christian theology, Greek language, and imperial ambition. The empire had weathered centuries of external threats and internal instability. While the Western Roman Empire had collapsed in the 5th century under the pressure of Germanic invasions, the eastern half had survived and even thrived. By the beginning of the 6th century, it had become not only a military and political force, but also a hub of commerce, learning, and culture. And at the heart of this empire, during the years just before the plague, was Emperor Justinian I. Justinian I came to the throne in the year 527. Born into a modest family in the Balkans, he was not expected to rise so high. But his uncle, Justin I, a career soldier, had taken power in Constantinople and eventually named Justinian as his heir. Once emperor, Justinian ruled with energy and a clear vision. He saw himself not merely as a caretaker of the Roman legacy, but as its restorer. He embarked on an ambitious campaign to reconquer the lost western provinces that had fallen to Germanic tribes over the past century. Under his general Belisarius, the empire launched military campaigns in North Africa against the Vandals, in Italy against the Ostrogoths, and in parts of southern Spain against the Visigoths. These campaigns, though costly, temporarily expanded imperial control across large portions of the Western Mediterranean. At home, Justinian initiated significant reforms. His most famous legal achievement was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the Body of Civil Law. Compiled by a team led by the legal scholar Tribonian, this legal code preserved Roman law and would later influence legal systems throughout Europe. It was one of the greatest intellectual undertakings of late antiquity and a reflection of Justinian's determination to bring order and clarity to his empire. His building projects were equally grand. The most famous was the reconstruction of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, completed in the year 537. Its massive dome and soaring architecture became a symbol of imperial might and divine favor. Justinian is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee," upon its completion, pointing to his belief that he ruled with both Roman authority and Christian righteousness. The empire's bureaucracy was vast, with officials managing taxation, law, grain shipments, and local governance. The system was both efficient and rigid, relying on careful administration and consistent revenue. Trade flowed through Constantinople from the east and the south, bringing silk from China, spices from India, and grain from Egypt. The Nile River and Red Sea routes were especially vital for sustaining Constantinople's population and army. Yet the empire faced problems. The military campaigns drained the treasury, and the wars in Italy dragged on far longer than anticipated. Taxation was heavy and sometimes brutally enforced. Religious tensions were also high, particularly due to disputes over Christological doctrine. The empire's Christian faith was deeply divided between different interpretations of the nature of Christ, which caused unrest in provinces such as Egypt and Syria. While Justinian attempted to enforce religious unity, these divisions would remain unresolved and politically damaging. In the streets of Constantinople, life was vibrant but precarious. The city was densely populated, with grand public spaces, markets, aqueducts, and massive walls. The urban poor depended on grain distributions and state employment, while the elite maneuvered for influence at court. Chariot racing in the Hippodrome was more than entertainment. It was a political and social institution. The two main factions, the Blues and the Greens, held both popular and aristocratic support, and occasionally erupted into violence, as in the Nika riots of 532. The Nika riots were a shocking episode of near revolution in the heart of the capital. Angry over taxation and perceived injustice, supporters of both factions united against the emperor, setting fire to parts of the city and calling for his removal. For a brief moment, Justinian considered fleeing, but it was Empress Theodora who famously persuaded him to stay. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," she is said to have told him. With renewed resolve, Justinian ordered his generals to crush the revolt, and thousands were killed in the Hippodrome. The regime survived, but the memory of that violence lingered. By the early 5th decade of the 6th century, the empire had achieved a kind of uneasy strength. It was overstretched but functional, battered but ambitious. Justinian's rule was marked by grandeur, vision, and a belief in the providential role of empire. Yet, beneath the surface, the state was fragile. The wars, famines, and unrest had already tested its limits. And then came something no emperor, no general, and no lawmaker could control. From the ports of Egypt, from the ships that sailed toward the heart of the empire, a new threat was beginning to emerge. It did not come with banners or swords. It could not be reasoned with or exiled. It moved silently through trade routes, hidden in the bodies of fleas and the fur of rats, riding the currents of imperial commerce. Before the plague ever reached the imperial heartland, it traveled quietly through a vast network of roads, sea routes, and caravan trails that connected the Eastern Roman Empire to the wider world. These connections were the arteries of Justinian's realm. They brought wealth, goods, people, and, ultimately, the plague. To understand how the disease reached Constantinople, we must first understand how the empire moved, traded, and communicated with the regions beyond its borders. The Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century depended heavily on trade. Its economy, especially in urban centers, was tied to the continuous movement of grain, silk, spices, wine, olive oil, and a range of other commodities. Trade routes stretched in every direction: north into the Balkans and Black Sea region, east into Persia and Central Asia, south into Egypt and Nubia, and west across the Mediterranean. Each of these routes passed through cities and ports where merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims met. The movement of people was constant, and with them came disease. One of the most important trade arteries for the empire was the Red Sea and Nile corridor. Egypt, a crucial province, supplied the grain that fed much of Constantinople. Its economy was built on the fertile Nile floodplain, where harvests were transported by boat to Alexandria and then shipped to the imperial capital. The grain fleet was essential, not just for the survival of the capital's population, but for maintaining political order. A disruption in this system could lead to famine and riots in the streets of Constantinople. The port city of Pelusium, located near the mouth of the eastern Nile Delta, served as one of the main entry points for goods moving between Egypt and the Mediterranean. It was here, according to some of the earliest accounts, that the plague first struck. Pelusium sat at the crossroads of several routes. Goods and people flowed in from Upper Egypt, down the Nile. Caravans arrived from Arabia and Nubia, and Red Sea ports brought maritime traffic from further afield, including the Horn of Africa, the Persian Gulf, and even Western India. The broader Indian Ocean trading system, connecting East Africa, Southern Arabia, India, and beyond, fed into Egypt's Red Sea ports like Berenice and Clysma. These ports, while less familiar today, were busy hubs in late antiquity. Spices, incense, ivory, textiles, and exotic animals were among the valuable cargo carried north to the Mediterranean. It was through this system that goods from as far as India and Sri Lanka made their way to the empire. With those goods came sailors, merchants, and dock workers, each a potential unwitting carrier of disease. The disease in question, now known to be caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is primarily transmitted by fleas that live on rodents, particularly black rats. These rats were common on ships and in grain storage facilities. In the ancient world, where cleanliness standards were vastly different, and food was often transported in open containers. Rats could easily stow away on board ships, especially those carrying grain. The fleas feeding on infected rats would later bite humans, transmitting the deadly bacterium. This method of transmission made Egypt particularly vulnerable. Grain storage facilities in Alexandria, Pelusium, and other key cities were ideal breeding grounds for rat populations. As the grain was loaded onto ships bound for Constantinople and other imperial centers, rats and their fleas made the journey as well. The movement was not rapid by modern standards, but it was relentless. What began as a local outbreak could, over the span of months, spread through entire regions connected by trade. While Egypt served as the southern gateway, the empire's eastern frontier provided another route for potential infection. Roman trade and diplomacy with the Sasanian Empire, its rival and occasional enemy in Persia, created continuous exchanges of goods and people. Along the Silk Road, caravans transported silk, jade, horses, and other valuable commodities across vast distances. These overland routes connected Central Asia, northern India, and western China to the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Recent archaeological and genetic research suggests that Yersinia pestis originated in Central Asia, likely in the region around the Tian Shan Mountains or the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. From there, it may have spread westward along trade routes, hitching rides with traders, nomadic groups, or even through captured or migrating animals. By the time the plague appeared in Egypt, it had likely traveled through a complex chain of exchanges stretching across thousands of miles. The Eastern Roman Empire, despite its military strength and administrative sophistication, had no concept of germ theory. Disease was understood in spiritual, astrological, or humoral terms. There was no practical way to detect or prepare for a microbial threat moving silently across trade routes. The same routes that allowed Justinian to supply his armies and feed his cities also became the pathways of disaster. It is important to recognize that the empire's interconnectedness, one of its greatest strengths, became a source of vulnerability. The efficiency of its grain distribution system, the regularity of its shipping schedules, and the density of its urban centers all created ideal conditions for a fast-moving pandemic. The very success of Roman infrastructure helped accelerate the spread. Moreover, cities like Alexandria were cosmopolitan centers with large populations living in close quarters. People moved in and out of urban areas for work, pilgrimage, trade, and military duty. With no understanding of quarantine or infection control, people continued traveling long after the first cases appeared. Once the disease took hold in one city, it was only a matter of time before it moved to the next. The sea itself offered no barrier. Mediterranean maritime trade was continuous, with hundreds of vessels crisscrossing the waters at any given time. From Alexandria, a ship could reach Constantinople in a matter of weeks, depending on winds and currents. Even without modern transportation, the Eastern Roman Empire was remarkably connected for its time, and that connection proved fatal. The logistical routes from Egypt to Constantinople were among the most heavily trafficked in the empire. Large grain ships, often state-managed, made regular journeys from Egyptian ports to the capital. Once the plague had embedded itself in the Egyptian grain system, it was almost guaranteed to reach the imperial capital. The delay between the first outbreak in Egypt and the full-blown crisis in Constantinople was likely no more than several months. It was not just Constantinople that was at risk. Other major cities, Antioch, Jerusalem, Ephesus, and Thessalonica, were linked through similar channels. From the eastern deserts to the western coasts of Italy, from the Nile Delta to the Bosporus, the web of Roman commerce was vast. The plague was not constrained to a single region or demographic. It would spread wherever people and goods moved. By the end of the 6th century, this disease would travel as far west as the British Isles and as far east as Persia. But its first major appearance, and the moment when it became impossible to ignore, began in the bustling ports of Egypt. There, the first symptoms appeared. There, the first rumors began to spread. And there, imperial administrators likely sent early reports of strange deaths and unexplained illness, reports that may have been dismissed, misunderstood, or simply lost in the bureaucracy. Long before it erupted in the cities of the Eastern Roman Empire, the bacterium known as Yersinia pestis had been evolving silently in remote corners of the natural world. Its journey to becoming one of history's deadliest pathogens is rooted not in the politics of empire or the ambitions of emperors, but in the slow, hidden rhythms of ecological systems. Understanding where the plague came from and how it made the leap into human populations is essential to understanding how the pandemic unfolded. The bacterium Yersinia pestis is named after Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French physician who identified it during the Hong Kong outbreak of 1894. But its evolutionary history stretches back thousands of years before that moment. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA extracted from human remains has shown that this particular pathogen likely originated in Central Asia, possibly in the region around the Tian Shan Mountains or the grasslands of present-day Western China and Mongolia. In this vast area of steppe, mountain, and desert, small rodents, especially marmots, gerbils, and various ground squirrel species, acted as natural hosts. These animals lived in stable colonies and carried fleas that fed on their blood. In this environment, Yersinia pestis circulated quietly, sometimes causing die-offs in rodent populations, but often persisting without major disruption. The bacterium existed in what scientists call a sylvatic cycle, largely confined to wild animal populations and the fleas that parasitized them. The leap from rodents to humans required a series of changes: environmental, social, and economic. Fleas are the key intermediaries in this process. When a flea feeds on an infected rodent, it ingests the bacteria. In some cases, the bacteria multiply in the flea's digestive system, blocking its ability to feed properly. Starving, the flea tries to bite again and again, regurgitating infected material into the host's bloodstream. This process allows Yersinia pestis to move from host to host, eventually reaching humans. The specific moment when the bacterium left its natural reservoirs and began to infect human populations in large numbers is impossible to pinpoint. However, the movement of nomadic groups, increased trade along the Silk Road, and periods of environmental stress, such as droughts or colder climates, may have pushed infected rodents and fleas into closer contact with humans. Caravans traveling across Central Asia, carrying goods and animals, could have unknowingly served as mobile platforms for this transmission. Once the bacterium entered human populations, it caused 3 primary forms of disease. The most well-known is bubonic plague, marked by the sudden swelling of lymph nodes, called buboes, usually in the groin, armpit, or neck. These swellings are intensely painful and often accompanied by fever, chills, and exhaustion. If untreated, death can occur within days. The second form is septicemic plague, which occurs when the bacteria multiply in the bloodstream, leading to tissue death and internal bleeding. This form can develop rapidly and is often fatal without any external buboes. The third and most dangerous form is pneumonic plague, in which the bacteria infect the lungs and can be transmitted through airborne droplets from coughing. Pneumonic plague spreads more easily between people and kills even more quickly than the other forms. Modern understanding of Yersinia pestis was not available to those who lived in the 6th century. They had no idea what caused the symptoms and no knowledge of how it spread. From their perspective, people simply became ill suddenly, swelling, bleeding, and dying in terrifying numbers. But science today can reconstruct part of the path the bacterium took. Recent research involving ancient DNA has confirmed that the strain responsible for the Justinianic plague, the pandemic that began in the mid-6th century, is genetically distinct from the strain that caused the later Black Death in the 14th century. This means that the 6th century pandemic was a separate emergence of the same species of bacterium. Genetic data recovered from burials in Bavaria and the British Isles show that the pathogen likely moved westward through multiple routes, eventually reaching the Eastern Roman Empire by way of its trade connections. One likely route was through the Indian Ocean trade network, where contact between Central Asia, India, and the Arabian Peninsula was regular and well established. Fleas or rodents infected with the bacterium may have traveled with merchants, stowed away in cargo, or attached to pack animals. From ports in southern Arabia or eastern Africa, the bacterium could have traveled north to Egypt via the Red Sea. The convergence of overland and maritime trade made Egypt a highly exposed point in this chain of transmission. In Egypt, conditions were ideal for further spread. The Nile River served as a natural highway, allowing goods and people to travel north to Alexandria and the Mediterranean coast. Dense populations, food storage facilities, and urban markets provided perfect conditions for rats and fleas to thrive. Ships loaded with grain often harbored rats in their holds. Once these ships set sail for Constantinople or other cities, they carried the bacterium with them, embedded in the ecosystem of trade. Importantly, the plague did not depend on direct human-to-human transmission to spread. Even if no one on board was yet sick, a single infected rat or flea could establish a new outbreak once it reached land. This allowed the disease to spread silently across vast distances, often without warning. In the cities of the Eastern Roman Empire, especially Constantinople, rats were an ordinary part of daily life. They lived in sewers, granaries, and alleys. Without modern sanitation, urban centers were full of potential hosts and habitats for both rats and fleas. As ships docked and cargo was unloaded, rats would disembark and explore their new surroundings, bringing the plague with them. Because the bacterium's spread relied so heavily on ecological conditions, especially the presence of rodent and flea populations, it did not spread in a uniform or predictable way. Some areas were hit hard, while others were spared for years. Climate and geography played a role. Cooler weather could limit flea activity, while warmer, more humid conditions often supported outbreaks. Seasonal variations might have influenced the timing and intensity of the epidemic's waves. Another critical factor was urban density. Large cities with high population densities, such as Constantinople, Antioch, or Alexandria, provided a rich environment for the disease to take hold. In these places, once the plague arrived, it spread rapidly. The death toll could be enormous, overwhelming burial systems and public health responses. In rural areas, transmission could be slower or more contained, though still deadly. It is also possible that other species played a role in the transmission. Some modern research has examined the potential role of human ectoparasites, lice, and human fleas in spreading the plague. While not the primary vector, they may have contributed in certain environments, especially where rodent populations were lower. However, the dominant understanding remains that Yersinia pestis relied mostly on rats and their fleas for transmission during this early pandemic. By the early 5th century of the 6th century, the conditions for a pandemic were fully in place. The bacterium had moved out of its natural reservoir, found its way into the networks of trade and empire, and established itself in regions of dense human population. The Eastern Roman Empire, despite its administrative sophistication, had no tools to identify, contain, or understand this threat. The mechanisms of commerce and urban life that had sustained the empire now carried within them a silent, invisible danger. The first signs were already appearing along the empire's southern edge, in Egypt, where strange illnesses began to strike port cities and villages along the Nile. At first, the pattern was unclear, but the death toll grew. What had begun as a localized outbreak would soon become a full-blown epidemic. In the spring of the year 541, the first confirmed outbreak of the plague within the Eastern Roman Empire struck the city of Pelusium. Situated at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, near the border of Roman Egypt and the Levant, Pelusium was a modest but strategically important city. It served as a gateway between Africa and the broader Mediterranean world, a key junction for trade, grain transport, and military logistics. The city was well positioned within the imperial infrastructure. Caravans from Arabia and the Sinai Peninsula passed through it. Boats arrived from Alexandria and the Red Sea ports further south. And although it was smaller than Egypt's great cities like Alexandria or Hermopolis, Pelusium's location meant that it was highly connected. This was precisely what made it vulnerable. According to later accounts, most notably those of the historian Procopius and the churchman John of Ephesus, Pelusium was the first city in the empire where the plague became visible. People began falling ill with strange symptoms, painful swellings, fever, and sudden death. The pattern was unfamiliar to local doctors and priests who had seen fevers, famines, and outbreaks before, but not like this. The disease struck without clear cause. It did not seem to follow the logic of seasonal fevers or the visible spread of wounds. A healthy person might become ill in the morning and die before nightfall. Others lingered in agony for days, their bodies swelling and blackening as death approached. It was, as many described, an invisible terror. The outbreak in Pelusium marked the moment when the plague moved from isolated cases, possibly occurring earlier in the Red Sea region or interior Egypt, into a form capable of sustained transmission through urban populations. The exact number of deaths is unknown, but contemporary accounts suggest that mortality was swift and severe enough to disrupt local administration and trade. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Laborers, dock workers, and farmers died in their homes, and with them died the knowledge of how to operate the local economy and infrastructure. The route the plague followed from Pelusium was, in hindsight, tragically predictable. From Pelusium, it moved westward along the Nile and into Alexandria, Egypt's most important port. Alexandria was a vast, bustling city with dense neighborhoods, large marketplaces, and immense grain warehouses. It was also the departure point for the grain fleets that sailed to Constantinople. By reaching Alexandria, the plague had positioned itself at the very heart of the empire's supply chain. John of Ephesus, a bishop and chronicler, described the events in Egypt with horror and sorrow. Although his accounts were shaped by religious interpretation, they provide valuable details about the human toll. According to him, entire households perished. In some neighborhoods, no one was left to care for the dead. Priests and monks worked to bury bodies, sometimes digging mass graves by hand. Fear spread more quickly than the disease itself. People began to abandon their homes. Trade slowed. Agricultural activity declined. The movement of the disease northward from Egypt to Palestine and Syria followed similar patterns. Roman roads and riverways connected every corner of the province. The plague likely moved in stages, from Alexandria to Gaza, from Gaza to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem to Antioch. Each of these cities was a significant center of religious life, commerce, and governance. As the disease spread, it overwhelmed local structures. In Jerusalem, religious processions were held to pray for divine mercy. But the deaths continued. In Antioch, one of the great eastern cities of the empire, the outbreak was especially severe. By the time the plague reached there, likely within months of its appearance in Egypt, the city was densely populated and already weakened by recent earthquakes and political unrest. The historian Evagrius Scholasticus, who was living in Antioch during the later waves of the plague, recalled how entire families were wiped out. Government offices closed, the courts stopped functioning, and daily life became a matter of survival. Throughout these regions, the disease spread not only through trade and travel, but also through the movement of soldiers and administrators. The Eastern Roman Empire was in constant motion, troops shifting between provinces, messengers delivering imperial orders, and merchants conducting business across borders. This movement allowed the plague to leap from city to city. The imperial government likely received early reports from Pelusium and other affected cities, but there is little evidence of a coordinated response in these initial months. In part, this is because the understanding of disease was limited. No one knew what caused the plague, how it moved, or how to stop it. Isolation and quarantine were not standard practices. Many people continued their normal activities until the disease struck their household or workplace. In addition, the bureaucracy in Constantinople was likely focused on other matters. At the time, Justinian's administration was engaged in military campaigns, legal reforms, and the challenges of maintaining imperial control over vast territories. A local outbreak in Egypt, while concerning, may not have initially seemed like a crisis. Only when the disease began spreading to other regions, and especially toward the capital, did its full significance become clear. The psychological impact of the early outbreaks cannot be overstated. For people in Pelusium, Alexandria, and Antioch, the plague shattered the expectations of daily life. The normal rhythms of commerce, religion, and social interaction were disrupted. Fear of strangers grew. People avoided contact with others. Rumors spread about divine punishment, sorcery, or poisons. The church tried to offer comfort and explanation, but even the most faithful were overwhelmed. As the disease continued its spread, it did not follow a single predictable line. In some places, outbreaks were brief and intense. In others, the disease seemed to smolder, flaring up again after weeks or even months. This irregular pattern made it difficult for communities to prepare or recover. Many places were hit multiple times over the course of a few years. For the empire, the real danger was only beginning. The plague's advance from the Egyptian coast to the Levantine interior brought it steadily closer to Constantinople. Every ship sailing from Alexandria, every caravan arriving from Antioch, carried the potential for infection. The Mediterranean, once the highway of imperial power, had become the vehicle of a slow, creeping disaster. By the spring of the year 542, the city of Constantinople stood unaware on the edge of catastrophe. For months, troubling reports had reached the capital, letters from provincial governors, rumors from travelers, and whispers among merchants spoke of a strange and deadly illness spreading through the eastern provinces. But no matter how alarming these accounts may have been, they could not prepare the citizens of Constantinople for what was coming. Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, was a city unlike any other in the 6th century. With its towering walls, grand palaces, bustling markets, and massive population, it was both a political and spiritual capital. It was here that Emperor Justinian I held court, where laws were written and where the fate of the empire was decided daily. But as spring arrived in the year 542, ships from Egypt and Syria continued docking at the harbors, bringing goods, grain, and death. At first, the signs were subtle. A sailor collapsed in the harbor. A merchant's servant died suddenly after complaining of a fever. Within days, more fell ill. Then, entire households began to report the same terrifying symptoms: fever, vomiting, and the telltale swellings in the groin or armpits. By the time authorities recognized that something extraordinary was happening, it was already too late. The plague had arrived. The earliest accounts of the plague in Constantinople come from the historian Procopius, who was present in the city during the outbreak. A court historian and close observer of imperial affairs, Procopius recorded the crisis with detail and urgency. He wrote of a disease that spared no one, rich or poor, citizen or foreigner, priest or soldier. The plague moved with terrifying speed, infecting some in the morning and killing them by night. Within weeks, the city was gripped by fear. People abandoned the streets, shops closed, priests performed hurried rites over the dead. Family members who tended to the sick often became infected themselves, and entire households vanished in a matter of days. One of the most chilling aspects of the outbreak in Constantinople was the scale of death. Procopius claimed that at its peak, as many as 5,000 people died each day. Some later sources raised this number even higher. Whether or not the figures were accurate, the reality on the ground was beyond anything the city had experienced. The dead filled homes, churches, and public buildings. The government had to organize mass burials, digging trenches outside the city walls. When space ran out, bodies were thrown into towers, stacked in boats, or left in the open. The bureaucracy of the empire, so carefully maintained by Justinian's reforms, began to falter. Courts stopped functioning. Tax collection ceased. Even the grain distribution system broke down. Civil servants died or fled. The city's vast machinery of administration ground to a halt under the weight of death. Religious institutions also struggled to cope. Churches were overwhelmed by requests for funerals, and clergy were among the victims. Some turned to public prayer and processions, hoping for divine intervention. Others interpreted the plague as a punishment from God, a response to the empire's sins, or perhaps a sign of the approaching end times. In the midst of this chaos, Emperor Justinian himself fell ill. For several weeks he was bedridden, and the entire empire held its breath. The fate of the state rested on one man's survival. If he died, the succession would be uncertain, and civil unrest could follow. But Justinian recovered. a moment of relief in a city otherwise drowning in despair. His survival, however, did not reverse the damage. The city remained paralyzed. Even the basic logistics of managing the dead became impossible. Laborers refused to work. Gravediggers died. The empire had to conscript people to remove corpses, offering gold in exchange for the dangerous task. But as the fear of infection grew, even this incentive became insufficient. Some of the most haunting images from this period come from the logistical efforts to manage the crisis. It was said that wagons piled with bodies roamed the city. When burial space became exhausted, bodies were dumped into the sea or bricked into sealed buildings. In one extraordinary act, a massive cistern beneath the city was cleared of water and filled with corpses, simply because there was nowhere else to put them. Daily life disappeared. There were no markets, no festivals, no public gatherings. Theaters were silent. The hippodrome races ceased. Families stayed indoors, avoiding neighbors and friends. The city, once full of movement and noise, fell into a heavy, unnatural quiet, broken only by the cries of the sick and the clatter of burial carts. What made the outbreak in Constantinople so devastating was not only the death toll, but also the psychological toll. People began to turn on each other. Suspicions grew. Some believed the plague was caused by poisoned wells or foreign plots. Others accused heretics, Jews, or Samaritans. Fear distorted reason, and tensions grew in the already fragile religious and social fabric of the city. Amidst all this, Justinian attempted to continue governing. Even as he recovered from illness, he issued edicts to stabilize the economy, control prices, and ensure food supplies. Some of these laws imposed strict controls on inheritance, as so many people died without leaving wills. Others aimed to prevent profiteering, especially by those selling burial services or essential goods at inflated prices. Procopius, ever the observer, noted how the plague disrupted not only life, but also the moral order. People who once held high office died unburied. The rich became poor overnight. Slaves inherited the homes of their masters, only to die days later themselves. In his words, the city became a scene of desolation. No social class was spared. As the weeks turned into months, the intensity of the outbreak gradually lessened. By the end of summer, the worst appeared to be over, but the damage had been done. Tens of thousands were dead. The economy was shattered, government offices were depleted, families were broken, and the city would never be the same. The outbreak in Constantinople marked the high point of the first wave of the Justinianic plague. It transformed the capital from the political center of the empire into a city of mourning and memory. Survivors emerged changed, by loss, by fear, and by the realization that their world could collapse so suddenly. As the plague took hold of Constantinople, what had begun as scattered reports of illness became a city-wide experience of dread. The scale of death was staggering, but behind the numbers was a human catastrophe felt in every street, household, and public space. To understand the true impact of the Justinianic plague, it is essential to look closely at what it was like to live through it. What people saw, how they suffered, how they tried to respond, and what chaos followed in their attempts to make sense of a world unraveling around them. One of the first and most terrifying aspects of the plague was the nature of its symptoms. Contemporary descriptions, especially those provided by Procopius and later John of Ephesus, offer detailed, if at times emotionally charged, accounts of how the disease manifested. Victims often began with a sudden fever and weakness, followed quickly by the appearance of buboes, painful swellings of the lymph nodes, most commonly in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings were often black or purple in color, sometimes accompanied by bleeding, vomiting, and hallucinations. Victims could die within a few days, or even within hours, of showing symptoms. For those who suffered from the septicemic form of the disease, the symptoms were even more horrifying. There were reports of people bleeding under their skin, their extremities darkening and dying. In cases of pneumonic plague, the infection spread to the lungs, leading to coughing, chest pain, and the expulsion of bloody sputum. This form was also airborne, making it more contagious and more difficult to avoid. These symptoms struck fear into the population not only because of their severity, but because of their unpredictability. Healthy individuals could go to sleep and never wake again. Others watched as their family members died before their eyes, unable to help or even touch them. Many victims suffered in isolation, as even loved ones feared getting too close. The human response to this horror varied widely. Some people, overcome by grief and panic, locked themselves in their homes, refusing to see anyone. Others turned to religion, filling churches to pray for mercy or organizing processions in the streets. Still others fled the city if they could, hoping that distance would offer protection. There were accounts of people abandoning the sick, even their own family members, in fear for their own lives. The bonds of kinship and community were tested to their limits. Amid the death and fear, physicians were nearly powerless. The medical understanding of the time was based on humoral theory, the idea that health depended on the balance of bodily fluids. Plague, from this perspective, was believed to be caused by an imbalance of heat, moisture, bile, or blood, or by foul air. Treatments were based on these ideas: bleeding, purging, herbal mixtures, or attempts to regulate the air with incense. None of it worked. In fact, many physicians died while attempting to treat the sick. Some people resorted to folk remedies or superstitious practices. Talismans were worn, strange diets adopted, and some believed that the disease could be driven away by certain prayers, chants, or rituals. In desperate times, logic and evidence often gave way to belief and hope. Though few believed they understood the disease, many clung to whatever methods they thought might save them. As fear spread faster than the disease itself, public services collapsed. Food became scarce, not because of agricultural failure, but because farmers and merchants were too afraid to enter the city. Markets stood empty. Grain deliveries from Egypt slowed. The price of food and goods soared, and what little remained was often hoarded by the wealthy or stolen outright. Civic order disintegrated. Constantinople, once governed by a complex network of administrators, judges, and city officials, became nearly unmanageable. So many had died or fled their posts that law enforcement and bureaucracy became ineffective. Thieves roamed the streets freely, and the dead were left unburied in alleys and homes. The empire tried to respond. Justinian, having survived his own bout with the disease, issued laws intended to control prices and punish those who took advantage of the crisis. Some officials were tasked with organizing burial efforts. Bodies were carried away in carts and wagons, sometimes buried in mass graves outside the city, other times disposed of in empty buildings or cisterns. But even these efforts collapsed under the weight of the disaster. One particularly grim detail comes from the accounts of workers who were paid to collect the dead. When the number of corpses became unmanageable, the authorities dug massive trenches and filled them layer by layer, covering each tier with lime before adding another. Eventually, even the space for mass graves ran out. Bodies were stacked in abandoned buildings or left to rot in the streets. The stench became unbearable. Religious leaders, too, were overwhelmed. Churches served not only as places of worship, but also as emergency shelters, makeshift clinics, and burial sites. Clergy performed last rites continuously, often falling ill themselves. Some churches ran out of space for burials and had to seal tombs with dozens of bodies inside. The role of the church was complicated. While it offered spiritual comfort, it could not offer material relief. For some, the plague was interpreted as divine punishment. Preachers warned of sin and moral decay, urging repentance. Others saw it as a sign of the end times. Apocalypse-themed texts, sermons, and prophecies circulated widely. In such a world, where science offered no explanation and government offered no protection, people turned to faith and prophecy to make sense of their suffering. Yet, amid the horror, there were also stories of resilience. Some citizens stayed behind to care for the sick. Monks and nuns, motivated by duty or compassion, tended to plague victims at great personal risk. Neighbors brought food to those in quarantine. Even in the face of unimaginable death, not all human bonds were broken. The social impact of the plague also began to reshape the city's fabric. With so many people dead, entire neighborhoods were depopulated. properties were left abandoned. Inheritance laws had to be rewritten. The legal system struggled to determine who had rightful claim to land or assets when entire families had perished. The sudden redistribution of wealth and property changed the makeup of urban society. Slaves were freed by the deaths of their masters. Poor men inherited homes by chance. Families who had been powerful for generations disappeared entirely. The psychological toll of living through such a collapse cannot be overstated. Survivors were left with deep trauma. Some wrote of a city forever haunted by memory. Others abandoned city life altogether, moving to the countryside or taking religious vows. Life after the plague would never be quite the same. In Constantinople and elsewhere, the plague had shattered not only bodies, but systems: economic, political, religious, and social. It had revealed how fragile the empire's order truly was when faced with a crisis of this scale. But the disease did not stop at Constantinople. As the capital suffered, the plague continued its path through the empire, reaching military outposts, agricultural regions, and trading cities alike. In the midst of the chaos that engulfed Constantinople in the spring and summer of the year 542, the fate of the Eastern Roman Empire appeared to hang by a thread. The imperial capital had become a city of mourning. Its streets were silent, its economy frozen, and its institutions crumbling under the weight of mass death. And then, just when the crisis seemed at its peak, Emperor Justinian I, himself gravely ill, recovered. This moment, though it passed without military drama or political upheaval, marked a crucial turning point. The emperor's survival allowed the empire to avoid a potential succession crisis, a collapse of central governance, or even civil war. Yet while the emperor remained alive and on the throne, the world around him had changed, and the road ahead for the empire would be marked not by recovery, but by exhaustion. Justinian's illness is recorded by Procopius, though with little detail beyond its severity and sudden onset. What is notable is that the emperor, unlike so many of his subjects, survived. Some historians have speculated that his access to better food, rest, and medical care, however ineffective, may have improved his chances. Others point out that many who contracted the plague did survive, even without treatment, depending on the form of the infection and the strength of their immune system. Regardless, his recovery was not simply a personal triumph. It was a political lifeline for the empire. At the time, there was no designated heir to the throne. Justinian had no surviving children. His closest political ally and most trusted advisor, Empress Theodora, remained at his side, but even she could not rule alone. Had the emperor died, there would have been a scramble for succession among rival generals, senators, and provincial governors. The plague had already destabilized much of the bureaucracy, and the loss of imperial authority could have plunged the empire into civil conflict at a moment of maximum vulnerability. Instead, Justinian resumed his role as emperor, weakened but determined. His first challenge was to restore some degree of normalcy in a capital still haunted by death. Government offices reopened slowly. Orders were issued to clean the streets, bury the remaining dead, and repair infrastructure. The imperial treasury, strained by the ongoing wars and now by the cost of crisis response, began collecting taxes once more, though enforcement remained patchy and inconsistent in areas heavily depopulated. Perhaps one of the most urgent tasks facing Justinian's administration was rebuilding the state apparatus. Many officials, clerks, judges, and military officers had died during the plague. Their posts needed to be refilled. Inheritance cases flooded the courts as entire families had perished, leaving unclear lines of succession for land, homes, and businesses. In response, Justinian issued new laws to clarify property rights, regulate wills, and prevent disputes. These laws were part of his ongoing effort to maintain legal order, but they also reflected the massive disruption caused by the plague. Meanwhile, Empress Theodora continued to play a vital, if often understated, role in imperial stability. She remained a political force in her own right, especially in matters related to religious policy and court appointments. Theodora's influence helped maintain continuity in governance during the emperor's illness and recovery. Her presence also signaled to the population that the imperial household remained intact and that the machinery of state would continue to function. While the capital worked toward recovery, the wider empire faced more complex challenges. The plague had not been limited to Constantinople. Reports of outbreaks in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Asia Minor continued to arrive. Agricultural regions had been depopulated. Trade had slowed to a trickle. Cities that had once sent regular tax revenue and grain shipments were now either in mourning or incapable of meeting imperial demands. This created a fiscal crisis for the state. Even before the plague, the empire had been stretched thin by Justinian's military campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and Spain. Now, with revenues plummeting and the cost of burial services, emergency relief, and military salaries rising, the imperial treasury was under enormous pressure. Justinian responded with increased taxation, especially on the remaining urban populations and landowners who had survived. This was deeply unpopular and, in some regions, led to unrest. The military was also affected. Troops stationed in the provinces reported outbreaks among their ranks. Garrisons in border areas, especially those facing the Persians in the east, were thinned by sickness and desertion. Recruitment slowed, not only due to fear of plague, but also because of population loss. In regions like Egypt and Syria, where recruitment traditionally drew from rural populations, entire villages had disappeared or been severely reduced. Despite these pressures, Justinian refused to abandon his larger goals. He continued to push for military control in Italy, where the long war against the Ostrogoths dragged on. General Belisarius, though often under-resourced and politically sidelined, remained one of the empire's most competent commanders. Yet the toll of the plague affected everything, from the speed at which supplies could be moved, to the morale of the soldiers, to the ability of provincial governors to raise funds and troops. The empire's enemies, too, observed these developments closely. The Sasanian Empire under Khosrow I, long a rival of Constantinople, recognized the strategic weakness caused by the plague. There were skirmishes along the eastern frontier and attempts to exploit Roman weakness, though these conflicts remained limited during the early years of the plague. It is possible that the disease also reached Persian territories, reducing the capacity for a full-scale campaign on either side. Even in the face of these challenges, Justinian saw the plague as a crisis to be managed, not as a reason to halt his ambitions. His resilience is notable. He resumed building projects, continued legal reforms, and pushed forward diplomatic efforts with neighboring states. Yet, beneath this activity, the empire was fundamentally weakened. Census records from the period, though sparse, suggest significant population decline. Entire regions reported dramatic reductions in taxable households. Urban centers emptied. The workforce shrank. This demographic collapse had long-term consequences. It reduced the pool of skilled laborers, disrupted education and training, and altered patterns of land ownership and rural production. Farms went untended, mines closed, workshops fell silent. There were also cultural consequences. The loss of clergy, scribes, and scholars disrupted the transmission of knowledge and tradition. Some churches were left without leadership. Monasteries that had once been centers of learning were abandoned. In cities, artists and craftsmen died without apprentices to carry on their work. A subtle but important transformation began as cultural continuity was fractured. And yet, the empire held. Justinian's survival, paired with the resilience of the remaining administrative core, allowed the state to endure. It did not collapse. It did not fragment into warring provinces. It did not fall to invasion. This, in itself, is remarkable. By the end of the year 542, Constantinople was no longer the same city. Its people had been changed by grief, by fear, and by the uncertainty of living through a catastrophe they could neither explain nor prevent. The empire as a whole had entered a new phase, one of slower recovery, higher taxes, ongoing war, and the looming threat that the plague might return. And it would return. As the plague tore through cities and towns across the Eastern Roman Empire, its effects on civilian populations were immediate and overwhelming. Yet one of the most strategically damaging consequences of the outbreak was the blow it delivered to the Roman military. In an empire that was already stretched thin by campaigns across multiple regions, the loss of manpower, resources, and administrative coordination brought by the pandemic deeply compromised its ability to defend its borders and pursue its ambitions. At the time of the plague's arrival in the year 541, the Roman military was engaged on several fronts. In the west, Justinian's generals were attempting to reconquer Italy from the Ostrogoths in a protracted and brutal campaign. In North Africa, recently reconquered from the Vandals, imperial forces were still working to consolidate control and suppress local rebellions. To the east, tensions with the Sasanian Empire remained high, with intermittent conflict along the Roman-Persian frontier. The Roman military machine depended on a vast support system. Soldiers needed food, weapons, pay, and medical care. Horses and pack animals required constant upkeep. Roads and forts had to be maintained. And above all, the army needed men, recruited from both the provinces and the cities, to replace those lost in battle or to illness. The plague disrupted every link in this chain. As the disease spread into the provinces, it did not spare the military. Garrisons stationed in key cities and border fortresses began reporting high mortality rates. In some cases, entire units were wiped out. Supply lines broke down as transport workers and quartermasters fell ill. In cities like Antioch, a major base of operations for Eastern campaigns, the loss of both military personnel and civilian support staff left the army disorganized and vulnerable. One of the immediate consequences was a sharp decline in the availability of fresh recruits. In normal times, the army could rely on a combination of volunteers, conscripts, and allied contingents to fill its ranks. With the plague killing a significant portion of the young male population, the pool of potential soldiers dwindled. In rural areas where recruitment was most active, many villages had been depopulated or were struggling simply to survive. Families were less willing to offer their sons for military service when labor was desperately needed at home. Justinian's generals attempted to adapt. In some cases, they relied more heavily on mercenaries, foreign soldiers hired for pay. These included groups from the Balkans, Armenia, and even Germanic tribes. While often effective, mercenary forces were less loyal and sometimes difficult to manage. Their presence also increased the financial burden on the state, as they demanded high wages, especially during a time of scarcity and inflation. General Belisarius, Justinian's most trusted and skilled commander, faced these challenges directly during the campaigns in Italy. The Gothic War, which had begun years earlier, was already proving far more difficult than expected. The Ostrogoths were deeply entrenched. The terrain was difficult, and the war had become a brutal cycle of siege, famine, and counterattack. The arrival of the plague, even indirectly, further complicated matters. Although Italy was not the epicenter of the initial outbreak, the ripple effects of the pandemic reached the peninsula through disrupted supply chains, reduced reinforcements, and an overstretched administration. Troops sent from Constantinople arrived late or not at all. Naval operations were postponed due to crew shortages. Weapons and supplies were delayed in transit or rerouted to deal with emergencies elsewhere. Belisarius, who had already faced political opposition at court and had been recalled and reinstated multiple times, now had to manage a campaign with limited manpower and erratic support. Despite his skill, the war effort stalled. Cities captured by the Romans were recaptured by the Ostrogoths. Local populations, already suffering from war and now fearing disease, grew restless and resentful. The Gothic War dragged on for nearly 2 decades, draining the empire's resources and ultimately delivering far less than Justinian had hoped. In North Africa, the situation was equally complex. The region had been recently brought back under Roman control, but it was not yet fully pacified. Berber tribes resisted Roman authority in the hinterlands, and local unrest threatened the fragile balance of power. The plague arrived here as well, cutting down garrison troops and weakening the ability of commanders to respond to rebellions. Without sufficient reinforcements from Constantinople, Roman governors in Africa had to rely more heavily on local militias and hastily organized defensive forces. This made the region increasingly unstable and prone to flare-ups of violence. Meanwhile, on the empire's eastern frontier, the Sasanian Empire under Khosrau I watched the situation carefully. Although both the Romans and the Persians were affected by the plague to some extent, the Romans bore the brunt of the initial waves. Sasanian spies and scouts likely reported on the reduced strength of Roman border defenses and the disarray within imperial administration. While the Persians did not launch a full-scale invasion during the height of the pandemic, there were skirmishes, raids, and diplomatic provocations. In the years that followed, as the plague ebbed and flowed, the eastern frontier became an increasingly contested zone. In response to these pressures, Justinian authorized a series of emergency measures to keep the military functioning. These included accelerated recruitment policies, emergency levies, and increased reliance on irregular troops. In some cases, civilians were armed and organized into local defense units. Naval units were restructured to function with reduced crews. The empire even turned to enslaved people and freedmen to fill roles previously reserved for trained soldiers. These adaptations allowed the military to hold the line, but at a cost. Discipline suffered. Training standards declined. The once professional army that had secured victories under Justinian's early reign began to lose its edge. While the empire avoided catastrophic territorial losses during the initial pandemic years, it no longer had the strength to expand significantly or respond quickly to new threats. There were also strategic consequences beyond the battlefield. The empire's shrinking resources meant that some regions were deprioritized. Defensive walls were left unrepaired. Distant outposts received fewer supplies. Provinces that had once expected regular imperial support began to feel neglected. This fed into long-term processes of decentralization and local autonomy, which would shape the post-plague Byzantine world. Furthermore, the psychological effect on the army should not be underestimated. Soldiers, like civilians, were not immune to the terror of the plague. Marching through infected regions, seeing comrades fall ill, and facing an invisible enemy that could not be fought with sword or shield, these experiences took a toll on morale. Letters and chronicles from the period hint at deep uncertainty among the ranks and at commanders who struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of invisible devastation. Despite all of this, the Eastern Roman Empire did not fall. Its armies continued to fight, albeit less effectively. Its generals still won battles. The borders held. And though victory in Italy remained elusive and the eastern frontier tense, the empire endured. In retrospect, the plague marked a turning point in the character of Roman military power. It exposed the limits of manpower, the fragility of logistics, and the high cost of sustained warfare in a world racked by disease. It also accelerated the shift from offensive campaigns to defensive posturing, a reality that would define much of the Byzantine military strategy in the centuries to follow. While the collapse of urban life during the Justinianic plague is well documented through surviving chronicles, the catastrophe unfolding in the countryside was no less severe, only less visible. Villages, farms, and agricultural estates across the Eastern Roman Empire were devastated by the spread of the disease. For a society so deeply reliant on rural labor and agricultural production, the consequences were staggering and long-lasting. The impact in these regions did not unfold with the speed and spectacle seen in Constantinople or Antioch, but rather in a slower unraveling that would reshape the social and economic structure of the empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, though centered around cities, was fundamentally dependent on its countryside. The vast majority of the population lived outside urban areas, engaged in agriculture, animal husbandry, or related rural trades. Grain from Egypt, olives from Syria, wine from Asia Minor, and livestock from the Balkans all fueled the economy and supplied both the capital and the military. Peasants, tenant farmers, and rural laborers formed the backbone of this system. When the plague reached the countryside, often transported by traveling officials, traders, or through infected goods, the response was far less coordinated than in urban areas. There were no public health decrees, no imperial edicts posted in the village square. Instead, Rural people were left to face the unknown with limited information, fewer resources, and very little help. Contemporary sources rarely describe these rural outbreaks in detail, but their effects are indirectly visible in the records that survive. Legal documents from later decades speak of entire estates left untended, of farmlands falling into disuse, and of villages with only a handful of survivors. Some properties passed into imperial hands simply because there was no one left to claim them. Inheritance cases were tangled and delayed, and many landowners fled to cities or perished without heirs. What occurred in these agricultural regions was more than a temporary labor shortage. In some places, the demographic collapse was so profound that communities vanished. Houses collapsed from neglect. Irrigation systems failed. Livestock wandered untended, and crops rotted in the fields. In more remote or mountainous areas, it might have taken weeks or months for word of the plague to even reach local populations, by which time the disease was already present among them. The nature of rural life made plague containment nearly impossible. While the population density was lower, the lack of medical knowledge and organized responses allowed the disease to burn through communities unchecked. In some areas, people may have mistaken the plague for divine punishment, evil spirits, or poisoned wells. Religious practices intensified, with local shrines seeing increased activity while others abandoned their homes in search of safety. The abandonment of farmland had multiple cascading effects. First, it disrupted food production. This was especially damaging in an empire already strained by war and famine in certain regions. Grain output declined, particularly in key provinces such as Egypt and North Africa. As fewer agricultural products reached the markets, food prices rose, sometimes dramatically. The shortage of rural labor also meant that even surviving landowners could not easily restart production. Fields had to be cleared, seeds planted, and animals cared for, tasks that could not be performed by one or two individuals alone. Second, the loss of rural tax revenue dealt a serious blow to imperial finances. The Roman state depended on a system of land taxes collected from property owners and tenants. With fewer workers to till the land, many estates fell behind on their obligations or disappeared from tax registers entirely. This had an immediate impact on the treasury's ability to fund military campaigns, public works, and administrative functions. Third, social structures began to shift. The traditional hierarchy of landowners, tenants, and laborers broke down in places where entire layers of society had vanished. In some cases, survivors were able to improve their standing. Former peasants might take over abandoned lands, or freed slaves might claim their deceased master's properties. In others, rural populations became more vulnerable, forced to accept exploitative terms from landlords desperate to restore productivity. In regions with imperial estates, large agricultural operations owned by the state, the collapse of labor meant a decline in production and a scramble to find new workers. In response, the state began issuing laws aimed at freezing the rural population in place, forbidding peasants from leaving the land or fleeing to cities. These policies, rooted in Roman traditions of labor control, reflected both desperation and a recognition that the agricultural economy was in danger of long-term collapse. Clergy and monasteries in rural areas also faced difficult circumstances. Many monasteries relied on local donations, tenant labor, or their own farms to sustain themselves. The death of supporters, the loss of income, and the spread of disease among monks disrupted religious life in the countryside. Some religious communities disbanded, others retreated into isolation or took on the role of caring for the sick and burying the dead. The cultural memory of this rural devastation is harder to access than that of urban centers. Cities left behind texts, chronicles, and visible ruins. Villages left behind silence. But archaeological evidence from later centuries shows a pattern of abandoned settlements, a decline in rural building activity, and changes in land use that align with the timing of the plague's impact. In some parts of Anatolia and the Balkans, once prosperous farming communities shrank or disappeared. Large estates fragmented. In Syria and Palestine, irrigation systems fell into disrepair. The desert reclaimed marginal farmland. Even in Egypt, traditionally one of the empire's most stable and productive regions, papyrus records reveal a decline in agricultural transactions and land tax records for decades following the initial outbreak. This rural devastation had wider political implications. As rural populations declined, cities became increasingly dependent on fewer and more distant sources of food. Grain shortages made urban life more precarious. Provincial governors found it harder to raise militias or collect supplies. The loss of confidence in the state's ability to manage rural life contributed to unrest and a weakening of centralized control. In regions with large non-Roman populations, such as Armenians, Berbers, and Slavic tribes, the decline in Roman rural authority created opportunities. Some groups began to settle in depopulated areas, moving into lands that had once been tightly controlled. Others increased their resistance to Roman rule, recognizing that the empire lacked the manpower to enforce its authority as it once had. Despite these challenges, rural life did not disappear entirely. In many areas, survivors returned to the land. New settlements emerged in safer or more defensible locations. Agricultural techniques adapted. Some regions shifted from grain production to pastoralism, which required fewer workers. In this way, the rural economy began to slowly transform, not just as a result of demographic loss, but as a response to new realities. What emerged in the decades following the plague was a changed countryside, less populated, more fragmented, and in many cases more localized in its structures of authority and production. The strong, centralized system of tax-collecting landlords and imperial estates gave way to a looser patchwork of rural communities, some still loyal to Constantinople, others increasingly autonomous. The plague had begun in the cities, but its transformation of the countryside proved just as profound, and in some cases, even more enduring. The Eastern Roman Empire had long been sustained by its rural heartlands. In the wake of the pandemic, that foundation had been cracked, and its repair would take generations. The economic system of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century was a complex network of production, trade, taxation, and state-controlled logistics. For decades, this system had sustained military campaigns, urban life, and administrative governance across a vast and diverse territory. But when the plague began to hollow out the population, the empire's economic machinery, already strained by years of war, began to collapse under its own weight. The first and most immediate economic consequence of the Justinianic plague was the dramatic decline in the empire's labor force. This collapse in manpower affected nearly every sector of the economy. In cities, artisans, merchants, transport workers, and service providers died in large numbers or fled the urban centers. In the countryside, as outlined in the previous section, farmers, herders, and rural laborers were lost by the thousands. The shrinking pool of workers created shortages that could not be easily remedied. As a result, wages for surviving laborers began to rise. In both urban and rural settings, those who could still work found themselves in greater demand. Artisans could charge more for their services. Laborers could demand higher pay for harvests, transport, or construction. Landowners and city officials alike were suddenly competing for a dwindling supply of human effort. This marked a temporary shift in the balance of power between the working class and the elite. In many ways, laborers gained new leverage. Yet this newfound advantage was met with harsh resistance from the imperial state. Emperor Justinian's government, already alarmed by rising costs and declining revenue, responded with a series of economic edicts aimed at controlling prices and wages. These laws attempted to freeze pay at pre-plague levels, limit profiteering, and prevent merchants and workers from taking advantage of the crisis. One notable example is the decree that fixed the maximum price for a funeral. During the peak of the plague, burial services became so overwhelmed and so costly that the state had to intervene. Families desperate to bury their loved ones were being charged exorbitant fees for carts, grave diggers, and shrouds. Justinian's response was to set strict limits on what could be charged and to fine or imprison those who exceeded them. While these measures were designed to protect the vulnerable, they also revealed the increasing desperation of an administration that was losing control over market forces. The empire's revenue system, centered on taxation, suffered catastrophic disruptions. The Roman tax system was built on detailed records of land ownership, population data, and expected yields. Provincial administrators used these records to assess and collect taxes, especially from landowners and peasant farmers. But with entire villages gone, fields abandoned, and families wiped out, the basic framework for assessment collapsed. Despite this, the demands of the state did not disappear. The army still needed to be paid. Public buildings needed maintenance. Court officials, provincial governors, and bureaucrats expected salaries. In response, the imperial government increased pressure on those who remained. Surviving taxpayers were expected to shoulder the burdens of those who had died. In some regions, communities were held collectively responsible for shortfalls, a policy known as fiscal responsibility of the village. This meant that if half a village perished, the remaining residents were still required to meet the full tax quota. The results were devastating. Peasants who had survived the disease were crushed by tax demands. Landowners, already struggling with labor shortages, began selling or abandoning their estates to escape their obligations. Some people fled to the mountains or wilderness to avoid tax collectors altogether. The state responded with force. Laws were passed to prevent landowners from abandoning their properties. Attempts were made to reassign land and laborers to keep estates productive. The government even issued legislation that bound people to their professions or locations, forbidding movement between cities or villages without official approval. These policies foreshadowed later medieval forms of serfdom, where peasants were legally tied to the land they worked. Inflation also became a growing problem. With trade disrupted, coin circulation declined. The empire had long relied on the solidus, a stable gold coin, as the backbone of its currency system. But as local economies broke down and confidence in markets weakened, hoarding increased. People held on to coins rather than spending them, contributing to a deflation of liquidity in some regions and inflation in others. In urban centers, the collapse of commercial networks led to shortages of everyday goods. Imported items, such as spices, silk, papyrus, and luxury items, became harder to obtain. Prices rose sharply. Some traders made great profits during the chaos, while others went bankrupt. State-controlled industries, such as the production of military equipment and weapons, slowed down due to lack of materials and skilled labor. The imperial palace itself faced economic difficulties. While Justinian continued to fund building projects and legal reforms, the resources available to him were now limited. The cost of burying the dead, funding emergency responses, and maintaining a functioning administration drained the treasury. Court officials began to raise taxes even further or resort to the confiscation of property to fill the gaps. There were also broader consequences for long-distance trade. The Eastern Roman Empire had once benefited greatly from its position at the crossroads of East and West, North and South. Trade flowed through its ports and cities from India, Arabia, Persia, and Africa. But as the plague spread, these networks began to contract. Fear of infection slowed maritime travel. Some ports closed temporarily. Caravan routes were disrupted by depopulation and security concerns. The once thriving economy of the empire began to turn inward. In the provinces, some cities never fully recovered their former economic activity. Markets remained empty. Craftsmanship declined. Tax rolls shrank permanently. Even when the plague subsided, the economic wounds remained. And yet, in the midst of this collapse, new patterns began to emerge. In some cases, survivors acquired land abandoned by others. Wealth changed hands unexpectedly. New alliances were formed between landowners and former tenants. Some urban artisans were able to expand their influence as competitors vanished. These shifts laid the groundwork for the gradual transformation of the Byzantine economy over the next century, from a centralized, tax-based model to one more localized and diversified. The government's inability to fully restore its economic system revealed deeper structural weaknesses in the empire. For all its administrative sophistication, The Roman state had little flexibility in the face of sudden demographic loss. Its institutions were designed for a stable or expanding population, not one that had been cut by perhaps a third or more in only a few years. By the end of Justinian's reign, the empire remained standing. Its laws were still enforced, its armies still deployed, and its emperor still issuing decrees. But beneath the surface, the economy had been fundamentally altered. The plague had exposed the fragility of the system and forced a new reckoning with the realities of governance, labor, and wealth in a post-pandemic world. In an era without modern science, pandemics were not simply biological events, they were spiritual and moral reckonings. For the people of the 6th century Eastern Roman Empire, the Justinianic plague was not only a terrifying medical crisis, but also a theological one. The question that haunted cities and countryside alike was not merely how people were dying, but why. What had provoked this disaster? Was it divine punishment, a sign of the end times, or a test of faith? Throughout the empire, religious explanations quickly rose to fill the void left by the absence of medical understanding. The dominant framework of the time, shaped by centuries of Christian teaching, saw the world as governed by the will of God. Natural disasters, including disease, were not viewed as random, but as signs or judgments. The plague was no exception. Clergy, monks, and bishops offered sermons and treatises attempting to explain the catastrophe in spiritual terms. Some interpreted the plague as a punishment for the sins of the empire, greed, pride, heresy, or moral decay. This was not a new idea in Christian thought. The Old Testament was filled with examples of God sending pestilence upon peoples who had turned away from righteousness. These biblical references gave shape to the understanding of the plague in the 6th century. John of Ephesus, a leading church figure and chronicler during the time of the plague, offers some of the clearest religious reflections on the event. Writing from his perspective in the Syriac tradition, he described the plague as a divine chastisement. In his view, the suffering of the people was directly linked to their moral failure. He called on Christians to repent, fast, and turn back to God in the hope of receiving mercy. His account blends vivid description with theological interpretation, portraying the plague not as a natural phenomenon, but as a divine message. In Constantinople and other cities, public acts of repentance were organized. Processions wound through the streets, led by bishops and priests, chanting prayers and carrying crosses. The faithful were urged to confess their sins, to forgive one another, and to make offerings to the church. In many places, fasting was declared, and people gathered in churches to seek divine intervention. The emperor himself participated in these rituals. Justinian was deeply religious and saw his rule as ordained by God. Even as he dealt with the practical demands of governance during the crisis, he also turned to religious action. Churches were rededicated, saints were invoked. The empire's Christian identity became central to its response to the plague. However, the theological landscape of the empire was not unified. Deep divisions existed within the Christian world of the 6th century, particularly over Christological disputes. The empire was torn between Chalcedonian orthodoxy, supported by Justinian, and various non-Chalcedonian movements, including Monophysites and Miaphysites, who held differing views on the nature of Christ. These divisions often had political as well as theological dimensions, with different regions and communities aligning with different positions. In this context, the plague was sometimes interpreted through the lens of these doctrinal conflicts. Some Chalcedonian Christians viewed the suffering of non-Chalcedonian regions as proof of divine disfavor, while dissenting groups saw the plague as punishment for the emperor's persecution of what they believed to be the true faith. Rather than uniting the Christian world in a common search for meaning, the plague deepened existing fractures. There were also apocalyptic interpretations. For many, the scale of death and suffering seemed to signal the end of the world. Christian apocalyptic literature, long a part of the religious imagination, gained new urgency. Texts that described the return of Christ, the final judgment, and the signs of the last days were copied, read, and preached with renewed intensity. Earthquakes, wars, and famine, already present in the troubled empire, were now joined by plague as further evidence that the end was near. prophets and visionaries emerged, claiming to receive divine messages. Some predicted further punishment, others offered hope, urging people to prepare their souls. While some of these figures were embraced by the people, others were condemned as heretics or troublemakers. The line between prophet and fanatic could be thin, especially in a time of widespread fear and confusion. Monastic communities played a unique role in the religious response to the plague. While some monasteries closed their doors and isolated themselves, others opened their gates to care for the sick and bury the dead. Monks and nuns saw the plague as both a trial and a calling. They interpreted their suffering as a way to share in the passion of Christ and to earn spiritual merit. Hagiographies, biographies of saints, began to include accounts of holy men and women confronting the plague. These stories often described miraculous healings, acts of compassion, or divine protection. While many of these accounts were written decades later and may contain embellishments, they reveal how the Christian community sought to find meaning in the midst of loss. The idea that some individuals were specially favored or divinely protected became part of the spiritual narrative of the time. Relics also played a central role. Churches brought out the bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, or other sacred items, believing that these objects could ward off the disease. Pilgrimages were made to holy sites, though such travel could also spread the infection further. Faith in relics and sacred places did not disappear despite the failures of many such efforts to stop the disease. In Jewish communities throughout the empire, different theological interpretations emerged. Like their Christian neighbors, Jewish thinkers saw the plague through the lens of scripture and tradition. The Hebrew Bible, too, contains numerous references to plagues sent by God. Jewish communities engaged in fasting, prayer, and charitable giving as part of their response. Though less is known about these communities' internal debates, they were undoubtedly affected both physically and spiritually by the unfolding catastrophe. Not all responses were religious. Some individuals became disillusioned with faith, seeing the inability of prayer to halt the disease as evidence of divine absence or indifference. Others turned inward, focusing on survival rather than theology. But even among skeptics, religious rituals and explanations remained dominant in public life. Over time, as the initial waves of the plague subsided, the religious interpretation of the event became part of the collective memory. Sermons reminded the people of the suffering endured and the lessons supposedly learned. Church councils and theologians continued to reflect on the meaning of the disaster, weaving it into the larger tapestry of Christian history. The plague became a cautionary tale, a warning of divine justice, and a call to spiritual renewal. Yet, the religious response was not only about fear and punishment. In many communities, faith provided strength and hope. The rituals of the church offered structure amid chaos. The belief in eternal life gave comfort to those facing death, and the shared experience of suffering created bonds that, for some, transcended divisions of class, region, or doctrine. The Justinianic plague did not end religious life in the Eastern Roman Empire. It transformed it. The way people prayed, the way they thought about God, and the way they understood their place in the world all changed. And those changes would shape the religious culture of Byzantium for generations to come. The initial outbreak of the plague in the early 540s was only the beginning. While the catastrophe that struck Constantinople in the year 542 was the most documented and devastating of the early waves, the disease did not vanish. Instead, it returned repeatedly, sometimes after short intervals, other times after decades, unleashing new rounds of death, disruption, and fear. For the Eastern Roman Empire, and for much of the Mediterranean world, the plague became not a singular tragedy, but an enduring feature of life. Modern historians and paleogenetic studies have confirmed that Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Justinianic plague, remained active across several generations. Recent archaeological evidence from burial sites in Western Europe and the Near East reveals that the pathogen resurfaced multiple times between the 6th and 8th centuries. These recurrences struck regions already weakened by earlier outbreaks, deepening the long-term demographic and economic damage. The first significant reappearance after the initial devastation occurred around the year 543, within a year of the plague's first wave in the capital. This second wave spread more broadly into the Balkans, parts of Italy, and Anatolia. Because many cities and villages had not fully recovered, even a less intense outbreak could wreak havoc. Fewer workers, soldiers, and clergy were available to respond. Local authorities had minimal capacity to offer aid or restore order. The empire, still reeling, could only watch as the disease resumed its path. From this point forward, plague outbreaks became a recurring element of imperial life. Sources suggest major resurgences in the years 554, 560, and again in 571. Each recurrence brought fresh losses and weakened regions that had just begun to rebuild. The irregular timing of these outbreaks made them especially difficult to prepare for. Unlike seasonal illness, which followed predictable patterns, the plague could return suddenly, sometimes striking one region while sparing another. The historian Evagrius Scholasticus offers one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of these later waves. Writing from Antioch, he describes how the plague struck the city multiple times between the years 543 and nearly the end of the century. He himself survived the illness, though he lost many family members. Evagrius notes that each wave seemed to target a new generation, as those born after previous outbreaks had no immunity. His writings convey a sense of ongoing dread, a recognition that the disease was not simply an event to endure, but a recurring threat to life and order. In terms of demography, the repeated outbreaks prevented population recovery. Birth rates could not keep pace with death rates in many regions. Villages that had been reduced to half their size might never regain full strength before being struck again. Urban centers, already weakened by economic and administrative strain, suffered from chronic labor shortages. The empire's ability to levy troops, collect taxes, and supply its cities remained under pressure for more than a century. Beyond the Roman world, the plague also spread into Western Europe, North Africa, and the Persian Empire. In Gaul, the bishop Gregory of Tours recorded outbreaks in the later 6th century, describing how entire towns were emptied by sudden waves of sickness. In Spain and North Africa, similar patterns of depopulation and social disruption emerged. Even the Sasanian Empire, Rome's eastern rival, was not spared. Records suggest that Persia experienced significant mortality in the later 6th century, weakening its ability to resist later Arab invasions. This brings us to another consequence of the plague's repeated return. It helped shape the geopolitical future of the Mediterranean. In the early 7th century, as the Eastern Roman Empire fought to hold its territories, new forces emerged. The rise of Islam and the Arab conquests reshaped the region's power dynamics. While the military and religious fervor of the Arab armies played a central role in their success, historians also note that the demographic weakening of both the Roman and Persian empires, partly due to repeated plague outbreaks, left them vulnerable. The rapid fall of Syria, Egypt, and North Africa to Arab control in the mid-7th century cannot be fully understood without considering this context. These provinces had been essential to the Roman economy and strategic depth. Their loss dealt a severe blow to Constantinople's influence. Some scholars argue that the empire might have better resisted these invasions had it not suffered repeated waves of plague in the decades prior. By the 8th century, the frequency of recorded outbreaks began to decline. This does not necessarily mean that the plague disappeared entirely, but it seems to have become less virulent or less widespread. The final known wave of the Justinianic plague occurred in the mid-8th century, possibly around the year 750. After this, there is a long silence in the historical and archaeological record concerning major plague events, until the re-emergence of Yersinia pestis in the 14th century during the Black Death. The reasons for the apparent disappearance of the Justinianic plague after 2 centuries remain uncertain. Climate changes, shifts in rodent populations, changes in trade routes, or genetic evolution in the bacterium itself may have played a role. Whatever the cause, the legacy of 200 years of intermittent outbreaks left a permanent mark on the Eastern Roman world. Socially, the constant return of plague altered how people viewed time, history, and fate. Chroniclers began to speak of the disease as a defining element of their era. Generations grew up with the knowledge that mass death could return at any moment. Artistic representations of death, suffering, and divine judgment became more prominent. Religious responses to the plague became institutionalized. Rituals, prayers, and fasts designed to ward off or respond to outbreaks became regular parts of community life. Administratively, the empire was forced to adapt. The tax base was restructured to account for missing populations. Military service requirements were adjusted. Laws dealing with inheritance, property rights, and labor mobility were revised again and again as the empire struggled to keep pace with ongoing losses. Some of these changes became permanent features of Byzantine law and policy. In cities, repeated outbreaks drove people to migrate, abandon crowded neighborhoods, or settle in safer rural areas. Urban planning shifted. Some public buildings were left in ruins. Monasteries and religious foundations grew in influence, often filling the void left by diminished civic institutions. These transformations contributed to the gradual reshaping of the Byzantine world from a classical Roman structure to a more medieval, localized, and ecclesiastically centered society. The Justinianic plague, therefore, cannot be understood as a single disaster. It was a long, grinding process that reshaped the empire in waves. Each outbreak brought fresh trauma, new responses, and deeper consequences. From the year 541 until roughly the middle of the 8th century, the plague hovered over the empire like a shadow, sometimes dim, sometimes overwhelming, but always present. For a disaster as widespread and enduring as the Justinianic plague, its relative silence in some historical records is striking. Unlike the Black Death of the 14th century, which inspired vivid visual art, public monuments, and widespread literary reflection, the plague of the 6th to 8th centuries occupies an uneven place in the cultural memory of its time. Some chroniclers documented it in stark detail, others, surprisingly, barely mentioned it. This absence, partial or complete, offers as much insight as the presence of formal accounts. In examining how the Justinianic plague was remembered or at times forgotten, we must consider who was writing history during this period, what they chose to include, and why some narratives prioritized different events. The 6th century was a time of war, theological conflict, imperial ambition, and political upheaval. The plague, though devastating, existed within a crowded landscape of crises. Among those who did record the plague in vivid terms was Procopius of Caesarea, court historian to Emperor Justinian I. In his wars, Procopius largely focuses on the military campaigns and achievements of the emperor. However, in his secret history and buildings, he allows space to mention the horrors of the plague. He describes the physical symptoms, the overwhelming death toll, and the logistical failures in managing the dead. His account is valuable because it was composed close to the time of the first outbreak and reflects the confusion, fear, and awe experienced by those who lived through it. Yet even in Procopius's work, the plague is a contained episode. Intense, yes, but not presented as the centerpiece of the age. His broader focus remains on Justinian's political and military efforts. It is possible that, like many chroniclers of the time, he struggled to integrate a disease with no clear human enemy into a narrative shaped by human action, divine will, and imperial ambition. John of Ephesus, a Monophysite cleric and historian writing in Syriac, offers another perspective. His account is far more detailed in describing the plague's toll on everyday people. He records mass deaths in cities and countryside alike, and his writings carry a strong moral tone, interpreting the event as divine chastisement. His position outside the Chalcedonian orthodoxy of the imperial church gave him a different angle on the events, and his concern for the spiritual lives of the afflicted provides a valuable contrast to the more politically centered Greek language histories. Evagrius Scholasticus, writing in the late 6th century, provides yet another valuable record. His ecclesiastical history covers the period of repeated outbreaks, and he personally survived the disease. Evagrius lost family and friends to the plague, and he wrote with a tone of weary resignation, noting how the disease seemed to strike each new generation in turn. His text offers one of the longest continuous accounts of the plague's recurrence over decades. Despite these records, there is a noticeable lack of literary and artistic response to the Justinianic plague when compared with later pandemics. There are few surviving poems, visual depictions, or theological treatises focused solely on the plague. Even in sermons and ecclesiastical literature, references are often brief or tied to broader themes of suffering and repentance. Why this silence? One explanation lies in the nature of 6th century culture. Unlike the later medieval world, which saw a flourishing of visual representation in the form of illuminated manuscripts and frescoes, the 6th century Byzantine world remained more textual and liturgical in its public expressions. Art was focused on religious iconography, imperial glory, and classical revival. Disease, unpredictable, chaotic, and beyond human control, fit uneasily into this world of structured meaning. Another factor was the episodic nature of the plague. Unlike a single dramatic wave that reshaped memory all at once, the Justinianic plague returned in intervals across 2 centuries. Each generation experienced it differently, and for some, the experience may have faded quickly in the absence of widespread written culture, especially in rural areas. Local trauma might not have translated into empire-wide cultural remembrance. Moreover, the chroniclers who shaped Byzantine history were often concerned with recording divine victories, theological disputes, and the actions of emperors and bishops. A disease that struck indiscriminately, killing rich and poor, believer and heretic, soldier and peasant, did not easily serve moral or political narratives. It was harder to assign blame, harder to find heroes, and harder to interpret with certainty. This complexity may have led some writers to understate its role or to frame it only in vague terms. Yet even if the plague did not dominate cultural production, its influence is detectable in more subtle ways. Legal codes from the later 6th and early 7th centuries show growing attention to issues of inheritance, property transfer, and the legal status of orphans and widows, topics made urgent by mass death. These adjustments, while not dramatic in themselves, indicate how deeply the plague had penetrated the social structure. Religious practice, too, absorbed the impact. Although no new rituals were created specifically for the plague, existing liturgies were adapted. Intercessory prayers for deliverance from pestilence became more prominent. Saints associated with healing, such as Saint Cosmas and Saint Damian, gained greater attention. Pilgrimage to sites believed to offer protection from disease may have increased, though records are sparse. In architecture, there is little direct evidence of buildings constructed in response to the plague. However, the interruption of major projects and the decline in new construction in certain areas reflect the economic and demographic strain caused by the recurring outbreaks. Some churches may have been rededicated or used as places of refuge during times of crisis. Perhaps most significantly, the plague left its mark on historical consciousness in the form of omission. The absence of monumental commemoration, the lack of an official imperial memorial or of lasting inscriptions, suggests a society unsure of how to represent its suffering. Unlike military victories or religious councils, plague did not lend itself to celebration. It left behind grief, not glory. Still, within theological thought, subtle shifts can be traced. The 6th and 7th centuries saw growing interest in theodicy, the question of why a just God permits suffering. While not all of this was driven by the plague, the persistent reality of disease likely shaped the tone and urgency of such debates. Some writers emphasized human sin. Others stressed divine mystery. In both cases, the language of disaster became part of the vocabulary of faith. By the 8th century, as the final wave of the plague subsided, its presence in historical writing became increasingly rare. Later, Byzantine historians, writing in the 9th and 10th centuries, devoted more attention to military events, religious controversies, and diplomatic affairs. The memory of the plague faded, becoming a background event rather than a central narrative. It would be centuries before Yersinia pestis returned to Europe, and when it did, during the Black Death, The memory of Justinian's plague had been largely erased from common knowledge. That erasure speaks volumes. It suggests not indifference, but a kind of cultural trauma, an event so destabilizing that it was more easily set aside than processed. Unlike later societies, which used plague to explore themes of mortality and transience through art and literature, the 6th century Byzantine world buried its dead with fewer words and less ceremony. Even so, the traces remain. In the laws that were rewritten, in the sermons that pleaded for mercy, in the letters of survivors who recorded their sorrow, these fragments allow us to reconstruct how the plague was experienced and remembered, even when it was not explicitly commemorated. Although the Eastern Roman Empire stood at the center of the Justinianic plague's recorded history, the pandemic did not remain confined to the Eastern Mediterranean. Over the course of the 6th century and beyond, the plague swept westward, carried by the same maritime and overland trade routes that had once fueled the prosperity of the Roman world. Its impact on Italy, Gaul, Iberia, and North Africa, regions that had long since fragmented into post-Roman kingdoms, was profound, though less thoroughly documented than events in the Imperial East. When the plague reached Italy, the peninsula was already engulfed in war. The Eastern Roman Empire, under the command of generals such as Belisarius and Narses, had launched a long and brutal campaign to reclaim the former Western Roman territories from the Ostrogoths. This conflict, known as the Gothic War, had begun before the first major wave of the plague, but continued throughout the following decades, overlapping with multiple outbreaks. The first known appearance of plague in Italy occurred in the early 540s, shortly after it had devastated Constantinople. It likely entered through one of the major port cities, perhaps Naples, Ravenna, or Rome, carried by ships from the Eastern Mediterranean. These cities, still integrated into the empire's grain and supply networks, were vulnerable to the movement of infected rats, fleas, and people. As in the East, the disease spread rapidly. Italian cities, already suffering from sieges, famine, and destruction, were poorly equipped to handle a biological disaster. Urban populations had been reduced by war. Infrastructure was damaged. The administrative capacity to respond was limited or absent. In many towns, especially those that had changed hands multiple times during the conflict, civic order had collapsed entirely. The combination of plague and war was devastating. Soldiers, weakened by poor nutrition and close quarters, fell ill in large numbers. Campaigns were delayed or halted. Supply lines became unreliable. In some cases, entire garrisons were wiped out. The Ostrogoths, too, were affected. There was no distinction between sides when it came to the spread of disease. The plague acted as a silent third force in the conflict, compounding the suffering and complicating strategic decisions. The city of Rome, by this point a shadow of its imperial past, nonetheless remained a significant center. According to later accounts, the city endured multiple outbreaks during the 6th century. Popes and bishops organized prayers and processions, similar to those seen in Constantinople. Yet with much of the city in ruins and the Tiber River prone to flooding, sanitation was poor and the disease likely spread quickly among the remaining inhabitants. Moving northward, the plague eventually reached the Frankish kingdoms of Gaul. The primary source for this region is Gregory of Tours, a bishop and historian who chronicled events in the late 6th century. In his History of the Franks, Gregory describes outbreaks of disease that struck towns and countryside alike. One passage tells of a mysterious illness that caused sudden death, with symptoms that match what modern scholars identify as bubonic plague. In Gaul, as elsewhere, the response was largely religious. Communities gathered for public penance, prayers, and almsgiving. There are reports of miraculous healings, divine punishments, and visions. Gregory's accounts mix spiritual interpretation with eyewitness testimony, offering a window into how the plague was understood by Western Christians. Unlike the structured bureaucracy of the Byzantine East, the post-Roman West lacked centralized authority, making organized responses rare and inconsistent. The spread into Gaul may have followed inland river routes and Roman roads still in use centuries after the fall of the Western Empire. Cities like Marseille and Arles, which maintained maritime links to the Mediterranean, were natural entry points. From there, the disease could move northward through trade and pilgrimage routes. Some monasteries, positioned along these roads, likely became sites of both refuge and contagion. Further west, the Iberian Peninsula, home to the Visigothic kingdom, also saw outbreaks. While written records from this region are limited, archaeological and circumstantial evidence suggests that plague arrived through coastal ports such as Cartagena or Tarragona. These cities, engaged in trade with Africa and Italy, were exposed to the same networks that had carried the disease across the sea. There are accounts from later centuries that describe sudden population decline and abandoned settlements, which may point to the effects of 6th century plague waves. The Visigothic administration, like its Frankish counterpart, lacked the tools to mount a coordinated public health response. The monarchs of this period were primarily concerned with religious disputes, especially between Arian and Catholic Christianity, and with the consolidation of power. It is likely that the plague, while disruptive, was absorbed into a broader landscape of instability that already included rebellion, succession crises, and economic hardship. North Africa, recently reconquered by Justinian's forces in the early 6th century, was also struck by the plague. Cities like Carthage, once vital Roman metropolises, had become key bases for the Eastern Roman military. The plague's arrival in these cities followed much the same path as in Egypt and Italy, via maritime trade and troop movement. The African provinces had only just begun to stabilize after the Vandal occupation and the Roman reconquest when the disease arrived, shattering hopes of a rapid recovery. Local Berber communities in the interior, who had long resisted imperial control, were less documented in Roman sources. However, some modern scholars suggest that the plague may have influenced the balance of power in these regions by weakening Roman garrisons and allowing greater autonomy for tribal groups. The limited written record makes it difficult to determine the full extent of the pandemic's reach in these rural and mountainous zones. What connects all these western regions, Italy, Gaul, Iberia, and North Africa, is the unevenness of the evidence. Unlike the Eastern Roman Empire, which produced dense records and detailed chronicles, the post-Roman West left fewer written traces. The preservation of texts was inconsistent, and many regions had limited literate elites capable of documenting events. As a result, historians must piece together the story of the plague's western spread from fragmentary evidence, archaeological data, and indirect references. Still, the impact of the plague can be inferred from patterns of settlement decline, changes in burial practices, and the sudden disappearance of once prominent communities. In some cases, towns shrank or vanished from the historical record altogether. Coins and pottery suggest interruptions in trade. In cemeteries, mass graves from the period may reflect episodes of epidemic death. Culturally, the plague reinforced a worldview already shaped by loss and transition. The Western Mediterranean in the 6th century was a landscape of ruins, once great cities now overgrown, roads crumbling, aqueducts dry. The plague did not cause the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but it intensified the sense of dislocation that followed its collapse. For those living through it, the disease was just one more trial in a world already filled with hardship. And yet, in some places, communities adapted. Local saints were venerated for their healing powers. Church leaders took on roles as protectors and providers. Religious institutions gained prestige as they stepped into the void left by vanished civil administrations. This pattern, seen across Gaul, Italy, and beyond, helped lay the groundwork for the medieval church's growing authority. The western spread of the Justinianic plague shows how deeply interconnected the Mediterranean world remained, even after the formal division of the Roman Empire. Disease did not respect borders or political systems. Whether under the banner of emperor, king, or bishop, communities from Carthage to Tours, from Rome to Toledo, were drawn into the same catastrophe. As the Justinianic plague tore through the Mediterranean basin, its reach did not stop at the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire. To the east, beyond the imperial frontiers, lay the powerful Sasanian Empire, Rome's rival and equal in strength, sophistication, and territorial ambition. With its capital at Ctesiphon along the Tigris River, the Sasanian state ruled over a vast and diverse population stretching from Mesopotamia to the Persian Gulf, and from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of eastern Iran. While fewer written records survive from the Sasanian world than from Constantinople or Antioch, modern historians and archaeologists now recognize that the plague did not spare this Eastern empire. Instead, it followed the same trade routes and patterns of transmission that allowed it to reach the Western Mediterranean, flowing through the arteries of interregional commerce and human movement. By the mid-6th century, Roman and Sasanian territories were connected through more than just war. Despite intermittent hostilities, the two empires maintained diplomatic relations, exchanged embassies, and permitted regulated trade. Caravans moved between Roman Syria and Persian Mesopotamia. Merchants carried silks, spices, precious metals, and livestock. Religious pilgrims and refugees passed back and forth, and emissaries from both courts negotiated treaties and prisoner exchanges. It was likely through these channels, most notably overland trade routes such as the Silk Road and the roads that connected Syria to Mesopotamia, that the plague entered Sasanian territory. While Constantinople struggled with repeated outbreaks, cities like Nisibis, Ctesiphon, and Gundashapur also began to experience waves of disease. These cities, major urban centers within the Sasanian administrative and economic system, were densely populated and highly interconnected, perfect environments for the plague to take hold. Although direct textual evidence is limited, Arabic and Persian sources written in later centuries refer to plagues affecting pre-Islamic Persia. One such source, the Chronicle of Sirte, written by a Nestorian Christian in Mesopotamia, mentions a devastating pestilence during the reign of Khosrow I, who ruled from the mid-6th to early 7th century. While the chronicle does not explicitly identify the illness as bubonic plague, the description of rapid mortality and widespread death closely aligns with what is known from Roman sources. Khosrow I, also known as Anushirwan or the Just, was one of the most capable Sasanian rulers, noted for his administrative reforms, patronage of learning, and expansion of infrastructure. Under his reign, the empire reached new heights of prosperity and military effectiveness. But the appearance of plague during his rule likely challenged even his formidable capacities. The plague's impact on Sasanian society was likely multifaceted. Just as in the Roman Empire, it would have caused severe demographic loss, disrupted agricultural production, and placed pressure on military readiness. With large portions of the population falling ill or dying, the empire's tax base would have suffered. State-run granaries, irrigation networks, and urban services would have experienced labor shortages. There may have also been increased unrest in rural areas, especially in provinces farther from central control. One unique aspect of the Sasanian response to the plague lies in its religious context. Zoroastrianism, the dominant state religion, emphasized the cosmic struggle between the forces of good, Ahura Mazda, and evil, Angra Mainyu. Disease was seen as a form of spiritual pollution, a consequence of the encroachment of evil into the material world. Priests known as magi were responsible for maintaining ritual purity, and their role would have been especially important during times of plague. This religious framework shaped both the interpretation of the disease and the practical measures taken to combat it. Fire temples, the central places of worship in Zoroastrianism, may have served as places of refuge or purification. Rituals involving the sacred flame, clean water, and the recitation of hymns would have been performed to restore cosmic balance. However, as with Christianity in the Roman world, these religious practices provided comfort but no real protection from infection. It is also possible that Sasanian medical institutions attempted to respond in more practical terms. The Medical Academy of Gundashapur, one of the most renowned centers of learning in late antiquity, combined Greek, Indian, and Persian knowledge. Physicians trained there may have observed the symptoms of plague, recorded treatment attempts, and developed quarantine procedures, though no specific records of such efforts survive. The plague's arrival during this time of relative Sasanian strength did not immediately tip the balance of power. However, As the disease continued to return in waves, it likely contributed to the long-term weakening of the empire. The economic and demographic toll would have limited the state's capacity to fund military campaigns, maintain infrastructure, and respond to external threats. These vulnerabilities became apparent in the early 7th century. After the death of Khosrau I, his successors faced increasing instability. Eventually, a new round of wars broke out with the Eastern Roman Empire, culminating in the climactic conflicts between Khosrau II and Emperor Heraclius. These wars, among the most destructive of late antiquity, left both empires exhausted. When the armies of Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the early decades of the 7th century, they encountered two ancient powers that had been weakened not only by war, but also, arguably, by a century of plague. The Arab conquests rapidly overtook large swaths of Persian territory. In less than a generation, the Sasanian Empire collapsed, replaced by the rising Islamic Caliphate. While the causes of this collapse are complex, the repeated outbreaks of plague likely contributed to the erosion of the Sasanian state's resilience. Fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, and fewer laborers meant that the empire could not recover from military setbacks as it once had. Social cohesion frayed, religious authority was questioned, and the traditional balance of power across the Near East shifted irreversibly. Beyond the borders of the Sasanian Empire, the plague may have reached even further east, though the evidence becomes increasingly sparse. Some scholars argue that regions along the Silk Road, including Central Asia and possibly parts of India, experienced outbreaks during this period. Trade hubs such as Merv, Samarkand, and Balkh were highly connected to both Persian and Chinese worlds. Caravans moved along these routes constantly, carrying not only goods but also pathogens. In India, where Buddhist and Hindu traditions coexisted with a rich body of medical literature, references to pestilence appear in later texts. However, the dating and identification of specific diseases remain uncertain. It is possible that Yersinia pestis circulated in certain regions without producing the same dramatic outbreaks observed in the Mediterranean and Persian worlds. As for China, historical records from the Sui and early Tang dynasties mention outbreaks of disease, but these are difficult to link definitively to the Justinianic plague. Nevertheless, the interconnectedness of Eurasia during this period suggests that the bacterium may have had a broader range than surviving sources can confirm. In tracing the eastern spread of the Justinianic plague, one sees a common pattern emerge. The closer a society was to trade routes and population centers, the more vulnerable it became. The same systems that brought prosperity and cultural exchange also brought death. Empires, no matter how mighty, were not immune to microbial forces. The Justinianic plague was not simply a humanitarian crisis of the 6th century. Its effects rippled far beyond its immediate mortality, leaving deep and lasting marks on the population structure and urban fabric of the late antique world. What began as a terrifying biological catastrophe evolved into a transformative demographic event, altering the human geography of the Eastern Roman Empire and reshaping how people lived, moved, and organized their communities. Over time, the cities shrank, populations shifted, and entire regions changed character. By the time the initial pandemic wave subsided in the mid-6th century, the empire had already suffered severe population loss. But because the plague returned in cycles for more than 2 centuries, it continuously disrupted any attempt at demographic recovery. Each new generation faced renewed exposure. As a result, birth rates remained suppressed, mortality remained elevated, and the social structure of towns and villages eroded under pressure. These demographic pressures were most visible in the decline of urban centers. The classical Roman city had been a dense, vibrant place, filled with theaters, markets, forums, aqueducts, and public baths. These cities were centers of administration, trade, religion, and civic pride. But by the 7th and 8th centuries, many of them had contracted or disappeared altogether. Take Antioch, for example, a city once counted among the great metropolises of the empire. Prior to the plague, it had endured repeated natural disasters and invasions, but still maintained a significant population and cultural influence. The waves of disease that struck the city in the later 6th century, followed by Persian and Arab invasions in the 7th century, left Antioch diminished. Archaeological evidence shows shrinking habitation areas, abandoned public spaces, and reduced infrastructure maintenance. Once grand buildings were repurposed or left in ruins. Similar patterns occurred in other cities across Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and North Africa. Urban populations no longer supported the expansive civic life of the Roman past. Municipal institutions, such as city councils, once responsible for maintaining public order and overseeing construction, began to fade. Civic elites who had once dominated city politics either perished or retreated to rural estates. Some cities ceased to function as administrative centers altogether. As urban life contracted, rural settlements and fortified hilltop communities began to grow in importance. These smaller settlements were easier to defend, required fewer resources, and allowed for a more flexible response to repeated outbreaks. People gravitated toward more isolated and sustainable ways of life. In some cases, entire urban neighborhoods were abandoned, while the remaining population clustered near religious sites or former fortifications. This process of urban shrinkage also had architectural consequences. Public spaces like baths, theaters, and colonnaded streets were no longer maintained. Stones were scavenged from old buildings and reused in churches or private homes. Monumental architecture gave way to simpler structures. Where Roman urbanism had once emphasized grandeur and openness, post-plague cities became more compact, utilitarian, and inward-looking. In addition to architectural transformation, the plague altered migration patterns. As cities declined, many people sought refuge in the countryside or relocated to regions perceived as less affected by disease. This internal migration further weakened urban economies, as skilled laborers, artisans, and merchants left behind dying markets and uncertain futures. Some regions, particularly those less integrated into long-distance trade networks, may have fared better. Remote mountain communities or islands with limited contact with the wider empire sometimes escaped the worst outbreaks. These areas gained relative demographic strength, though they often remained peripheral in political terms. Meanwhile, imperial control over frontier regions became harder to maintain. The empire's capacity to project power into distant provinces depended on stable populations and functioning infrastructure. With cities hollowed out and roads deteriorating, communication and transportation slowed. Tax revenue declined, and provincial governors found it harder to enforce order or mobilize resources. Religious institutions emerged as new anchors of stability amid this shifting landscape. Monasteries and churches often became the centers of post-plague communities. They provided social services, maintained literacy, and helped distribute food and alms during times of crisis. Monastic communities grew in size and influence, frequently settling in rural or semi-rural locations where they could manage land and host pilgrims. This shift contributed to the religious transformation of urban space. In many cities, the old forums and basilicas were replaced or overshadowed by ecclesiastical structures. Churches became focal points of daily life. Sacred relics were housed in urban cores. Processions and liturgical calendars shaped the rhythms of community activity. Even the visual landscape changed. Mosaics, frescoes, and religious symbols began to dominate public art, where civic or imperial themes had once prevailed. In demographic terms, some historians estimate that the Justinianic plague may have reduced the empire's population by as much as 1/3 over the course of 2 centuries. These losses were not uniform. Some regions recovered more quickly than others. Coastal cities with active trade suffered repeated outbreaks, while isolated inland communities sometimes escaped. Nevertheless, the general trend was clear. A smaller, more scattered, and more rural population base emerged from the ashes of late antiquity. This decline in population had important cultural effects. Educational institutions shrank. Literacy declined in some areas. The use of Latin in the Eastern Empire faded more quickly, replaced by Greek and later regional dialects. Classical learning was preserved in monasteries but became less accessible to the general population. The intellectual world of late antiquity narrowed. even as religious literature and commentary flourished. Urban decline also affected military recruitment. The Roman army had long depended on cities as sources of manpower, supplies, and logistics. As cities emptied, the military increasingly relied on frontier communities, rural levies, and foreign mercenaries. The centralized army system of the earlier empire gave way to more localized and flexible military structures, adaptations that would continue into the Byzantine period. From a wider historical perspective, these changes contributed to the gradual transition from the classical world to the medieval. The cultural, economic, and demographic structures of the Roman Empire had already been under strain due to war, climate shifts, and internal divisions. The plague accelerated these trends. It did not cause the end of the ancient world on its own, but it pushed existing vulnerabilities to the breaking point. In regions beyond the Eastern Roman Empire, similar patterns can be observed. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Merovingian realm in Gaul, and former Roman provinces in North Africa all experienced urban decline, shifting settlement patterns, and demographic contraction. These changes were often more gradual or less well documented, but the general direction was consistent. The old Roman world was giving way to a new order. Yet, from this transformation emerged new forms of resilience. Smaller, more self-sufficient communities adapted to the realities of a post-pandemic world. Religious networks helped maintain cultural continuity. Local leaders rose to prominence, often blending Roman, Christian, and local traditions. The outlines of what would become medieval Europe and the Byzantine East began to take shape. By the time the final waves of the plague had passed in the 8th century, the world looked very different from the one Justinian had inherited. His dreams of Roman restoration had faded. The cities he sought to rebuild had changed forever. The people who survived did not simply return to the past. They forged a new world out of memory, faith, and necessity. The reign of Emperor Justinian I has often been viewed through the lens of grand ambition. His efforts to codify Roman law, restore imperial borders, and fortify the Eastern Roman Empire placed him among the most active and reform-minded rulers of late antiquity. Yet no appraisal of his legacy can be complete without reckoning with the force that he could neither command nor control, the Justinianic plague. The question that historians continue to ask is this: did the plague fundamentally alter the course of Justinian's reign, and by extension, the trajectory of the empire and the broader post-Roman world? To answer this, we must separate intention from outcome. Justinian did not foresee the plague. His legal reforms, military campaigns, and architectural projects were initiated well before the first outbreak in the early 540s. His decision to reclaim former Western Roman provinces such as Italy and North Africa predated the arrival of Yersinia Pestis in the empire. These were choices grounded in ideology, imperial tradition, and strategic calculation. But the plague inserted itself into his reign like a fault line. At precisely the moment when his armies were making progress, when his legal codification was nearing completion, and when his capital stood adorned with the new Hagia Sophia, the pandemic struck. The timing was catastrophic. Consider the military implications. The wars in Italy were long and brutal even before the plague arrived. Supply lines stretched thin. Armies were dispersed across hostile terrain. When the plague reached the peninsula, its toll on soldiers and support staff exacerbated delays and reduced operational capacity. Reinforcements from Constantinople were harder to gather, not only because of fear, but because there were simply fewer men to recruit. Morale collapsed. Victories were reversed. The dream of a swift and decisive reconquest of the West faded. In North Africa, the reconquest had already succeeded, but imperial control remained fragile. Rebellions by Berber groups and internal dissent continued for years after Roman victory. Plague in the African provinces destabilized efforts to consolidate rule. Local governors faced rising taxes, labor shortages, and public disorder. What could have been a secure stronghold of the revived empire became a source of strain. Economically, the impact of the plague further undermined Justinian's reforms. His codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was one of the most enduring achievements of his reign. Yet it was implemented in a time of demographic collapse and social upheaval. Property rights, inheritance laws, and tax policies had to be continuously adjusted to respond to mass death and shifting ownership. Laws drafted for a thriving, structured society now had to contend with chaos. Fiscal policy also suffered. With fewer taxpayers and producers, the state faced a revenue crisis. Attempts to raise taxes often resulted in rebellion or abandonment of land. The plague hollowed out the very administrative structure Justinian had sought to reinforce. His famed construction programs slowed, and maintenance of public works suffered as both money and manpower dwindled. In Constantinople, Justinian survived the disease, but the city itself never fully recovered its earlier vibrancy during his reign. The economic and human losses disrupted urban life, trade declined, and fear became a constant. Justinian continued to issue laws and manage affairs, but increasingly from within a court that had become more isolated from the suffering of ordinary people. Yet despite all this, Justinian pressed on. He did not abandon his vision. He did not abdicate. He continued to rule for more than 2 decades after the first wave of plague. That in itself is remarkable. But the scope of his ambition was never again matched by the capacity of the empire to deliver. The tools had been dulled, the foundation cracked. Had the plague not occurred, it is possible that the Eastern Roman Empire could have more fully consolidated its gains in the West. Italy might have been brought into a more stable political union. North Africa could have served as a dependable resource base. Even Spain, partially reconquered during Justinian's reign, might have seen deeper Roman reintegration. Historians debate this counterfactual. Some argue that the empire's military commitments were already overextended, even without the plague. The distances were great, the enemies numerous, and the cultural divides between East and West difficult to bridge. Others point to signs of administrative vitality and suggest that, had the plague not intervened, the Eastern Roman state might have succeeded in recreating a modified form of the unified Roman world. Where consensus does emerge is in recognizing that the plague curtailed possibilities. It did not end the empire. It did not erase Justinian's accomplishments, but it reshaped the scale of what was feasible. The pandemic was not a single blow, but a sustained force that sapped strength over decades, delaying progress, distorting priorities, and forcing continual crisis management. In the broader historical view, the plague may have done more than undermine one emperor's plans. It contributed to a transformation in the Mediterranean world. The old Roman urban culture, with its monumental architecture and civic rituals, continued to erode. Political centralization weakened. Regions grew more localized. Religious institutions expanded their role in both social services and governance. These were trends already underway, but the plague accelerated them. Moreover, the Eastern Roman Empire, soon to be known more widely as the Byzantine Empire, entered a phase of retrenchment. The dream of Western restoration was shelved. Defensive priorities took precedence. New enemies, including the rising Islamic caliphates, confronted an empire still reeling from decades of biological and military attrition. Justinian's legacy, therefore, is one of both grandeur and fragility. He rebuilt Constantinople, launched ambitious military campaigns, and codified the law. But he also ruled during one of the most destabilizing pandemics in recorded history. His refusal to retreat in the face of disaster showed remarkable resilience. Yet his ambitions were inevitably reshaped by forces beyond his control. The question of whether the plague caused the decline of the Roman world is too simplistic. Decline is rarely the result of a single event, but the plague was a pivotal catalyst. It weakened institutions, disrupted economies, and undermined military effectiveness. It altered demographics, constrained policy, and shaped cultural memory. It did not create new weaknesses, but it magnified existing ones. In evaluating Justinian, we see a ruler whose vision exceeded the limitations of his time. His reign straddles 2 eras, the last chapter of classical Roman imperialism and the first of a transformed Byzantine world. The plague, silent and invisible, stood at the threshold of this transition. It did not end an empire, but it closed a door on what the empire had once been. The story of the Justinianic plague does not end with the final outbreaks of the 8th century. Though it eventually disappeared from the historical record, its impact endured, etched into the demographic, economic, and cultural landscapes of Europe, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia. But centuries later, a new chapter would begin. In the 14th century, the world would once again face a pandemic of Yersinia pestis. The Black Death, as it came to be known, would sweep across continents with terrifying speed. What connects these two catastrophes, one in the age of emperors and the other in the age of kingdoms, offers valuable insight into the recurring relationship between human societies and infectious disease. For a long time, the connection between the 6th century plague and the later Black Death was not fully understood. While medieval chroniclers of the 14th century described symptoms that resembled those documented by Procopius and John of Ephesus, the historical memory of the earlier pandemic had largely faded. The societies of medieval Europe, dealing with their own overwhelming losses, interpreted the Black Death as a unique and unprecedented event. The Justinianic plague, though perhaps known in some intellectual circles, had passed into obscurity. Only in recent decades has modern science begun to reconstruct the fuller picture. Through the use of paleogenetics, analyzing ancient DNA from skeletal remains, researchers have confirmed that the same bacterium, Yersinia pestis, caused both the Justinianic plague and the Black Death. This discovery was a breakthrough in understanding the long-term presence of plague in human history. It confirmed that Yersinia pestis had emerged as a recurring pathogen, capable of reappearing after centuries of dormancy or reduced visibility. In several European burial sites dated to the 6th through 8th centuries, particularly in Germany, France, and Britain, scientists recovered traces of Yersinia pestis DNA from victims. These findings proved that the plague had reached much farther than previously confirmed by textual sources alone. Even regions with limited historical records, such as parts of rural Europe, had experienced the same biological catastrophe. The pathogen did not vanish after its final outbreak under Justinian. It persisted, whether in animal reservoirs, low-level human transmission, or both, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to re-emerge. One of the key questions in historical epidemiology has been how Yersinia pestis survived between pandemics. Unlike viruses that require constant human hosts, Yersinia pestis primarily resides in rodents and is transmitted by fleas. In the natural environment, it can remain endemic in wild rodent populations, such as marmots, gerbils, or black rats, without necessarily causing human outbreaks. Under certain ecological and climatic conditions, however, the bacteria can spill over into human communities, especially when people live in close proximity to infected animals, or when trade and travel increase the reach of infected carriers. This reservoir system helps explain how the plague could disappear from human populations for centuries, only to reappear with deadly force. The disease likely persisted in pockets of Central Asia, the Caucasus, or other remote regions, periodically flaring up and then subsiding. When environmental shifts, such as warmer climates or disruptions in local ecosystems occurred, the risk of zoonotic spillover increased. Trade routes, particularly the Silk Road and maritime shipping lanes, became the channels through which the bacterium traveled vast distances. By the time of the Black Death in the 14th century, these conditions had aligned once again, with increased contact between Asia and Europe, fueled by the expansion of the Mongol Empire, growing commercial activity, and densely populated urban centers. Yersinia pestis made its return. From Central Asia, it reached the Crimean port of Kaffa and then spread rapidly across the Mediterranean, devastating cities such as Constantinople, Genoa, Florence, and Paris. The toll was immense, far greater than even the worst outbreaks of the Justinianic plague. Yet the parallels between the two pandemics are striking. Both emerged at times of intense interconnectivity. Both moved along trade routes. Both targeted cities first, then spread to rural regions. Both provoked spiritual and social upheaval, prompting questions about divine punishment, fate, and mortality. And both transformed the world in their aftermath, weakening empires, redistributing power, and reshaping economic and social structures. The reappearance of plague centuries later also reignited interest in its earlier history. In the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, scholars began to rediscover classical and Byzantine texts. As the scientific method developed, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers began to take seriously the idea of historical pandemics. In the late 19th century, Alexandra Yersin isolated the bacterium during an outbreak in Hong Kong, leading to the naming of Yersinia pestis. From then on, researchers worked backward, connecting modern microbiology with historical records to build a fuller understanding of plagues long past. The study of the Justinianic plague gained momentum in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, driven by interdisciplinary approaches that combined archaeology, climate science, epidemiology, and historical analysis. Advances in radiocarbon dating, ancient DNA recovery, and environmental modeling have allowed scholars to map outbreaks, estimate death tolls, and understand the ecological contexts in which the disease thrived. One of the most important revelations from this research is how pandemics are not merely biological events. They are shaped by and in turn shape the structure of human societies. The Justinianic plague spread not only because of fleas and rats, but because of roads, ships, grain storage, armies, and administrative networks. Its impact was not limited to mortality, but extended to policy, economy, faith, memory, and geography. From this perspective, the Justinianic plague serves as a historical mirror. It reveals how civilizations respond to invisible threats. It shows how political power confronts uncertainty, how communities adapt under stress, and how narratives of suffering and survival take shape. In the context of modern pandemics, such as those experienced in the 21st century, the 6th century experience offers caution, perspective, and reflection. It also challenges certain assumptions. Despite the scale of death, the Eastern Roman Empire did not collapse. It persisted. It changed. It adapted. Even in the face of demographic disaster, the structures of governance, law, and religion endured. This resilience is a key lesson. While pandemics expose weaknesses, they also illuminate the durability of institutions and the capacity for human societies to reorganize. At the same time, the limits of that endurance are also instructive. Justinian's vision of a restored Roman Empire never fully materialized. The plague was not solely to blame, but it played a central role in reshaping the boundaries of possibility. Where ambition had once stretched across the Mediterranean, survival became the priority. The transition from late antiquity to the early medieval world was not a clean break, but a process of adaptation, and the Justinianic plague was one of its main accelerants. Looking back from the 21st century, the Justinianic plague stands not as a distant curiosity, but as a deeply relevant episode in the shared human experience. It reminds us that disease does not exist in isolation. It intersects with empire, economy, faith, and identity. It leaves scars that outlast symptoms, and it shapes futures in ways that are often visible only in hindsight. What began in the grain ports of Egypt, what passed through the gates of Constantinople, what echoed through Antioch, Carthage, Rome, and Ctesiphon, was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. This is the story of the Plague of Justinian, a story of ambition and vulnerability, of memory and forgetting, of death, but also of survival. And like all great stories in history, it continues to speak to the world we live in today.